start with an apology. I prepared a talk for a larger audience, and therefore it will, I think, you might find it slightly lightweight. That's not because the larger audiences are they're necessarily less sophisticated, but just I think there is a sense of what people are looking for in those audiences is sometimes different than looking for something maybe more broader. And it may be what I'll try to do a little bit. You'll see me departing from the slides. I'll tell you a little bit more of many of the points I'll touch upon. I'll tell you a little bit more, but only a little bit, and then maybe again we might as well just do what Oriana did, just take the questions at the end. So this is sort of big picture about what have we learned from the work of the Poverty Action Lab. So when we started the Poverty Action Lab, I mean, in retrospect, I think I've said this many times, which is we had no clue to where this would land at all. I mean, to say that we had an inkling would be lying. I think we were entirely clueless. We were mostly spinning our wheels, and it looked like fine. We could try doing that, and we did it, and it was fine. But there was nothing particularly directive about this project. We still sort of had this idea that very, very big picture idea that you might as well use a bit more scientific evidence in reducing poverty. And when I say that, that might seem like a non sequitur, but it's not, and it was not. So what we do is a combination of rigorous randomized evaluations and policy outreach, often bringing the results from these randomized evaluations to a policy interested public, various constituencies, obviously, including policymakers, but not just, and capacity building in the sense of building sort of at all levels, getting people to understand what good evidence means. And that means sometimes one day of trying to disabuse people of their views of what they think is evidence, and sometimes it's 5 days of actually telling people how to do a randomized controlled trial, and everything in between, talking to the media, all kinds of ways in which. So, but I think the starting point, and this is the part where I think we were I think we had some confidence that and this very abstract level, the project we were taking on was reasonable. This example I've given before, but I think it's so excellent that I think I should repeat it. So there was a World Bank had produced, I was delighted to find it, an empowerment and poverty reduction source book, how to do it. It was a World Bank document on what works. If you didn't read it carefully, you might have missed it. But for example, it reported on a program in India where they put computers in villages, but there was no power, so the computers didn't run. The kiosks lost money, and many had shut. And then literally says, following the success of the program, that you can then. So it sort of challenged us a bit to think about what success might be in such contexts, and and how they came to conclude that this was a success. So, and I think that general impetus kept us going. But I think over time, I think we understood much better where that impetus came from, and part of that was. That we confuse ideology with evidence, and I think that's very often, that's why I'm sympathetic to what Oriana said about, do businesses actually know this fact? I'm going to guess no, because I think there's I think people will live in such closed worlds where there are, the narratives about, I'm successful because I did something, and I had talent and I worked hard. These narratives are so comforting that I feel like people wrap themselves in it. So I'm going to go out on a limb and say, actually, probably this would be news. But the second one, I think, is maybe more important, and the one that's less obvious. I come back to that point time and again. And I think, even when we actually have the right general principle, for example, Oriana said, education is very important. And it's true that improving education is difficult without more resources. But what does that mean? That's if you look at a economic model, fit it to growth data, all you have to do is say that more education, maybe more education spending might contribute. It doesn't. If you look at education and you compare the cross-country effects of education, countries that invested a lot in education have not grown faster than the ones starting in about 1990. You see pretty much no correlation. That's a longer conversation that we could also have. But main point is that even if you buy that, that doesn't get you very far. I mean, then you spend money on what? And on what turns out to be the key question. There's some of those things. I think the first set of randomized evaluations that we did, Michael Kramer did, I did, almost all of them had the one common feature, which is that whatever you did, it failed. And the reason they failed is that we were following all the standard shibboleths about what improves education, and we followed them religiously. Lots of randomized control trials, all of them failed. Turned out that none of them mattered. And then, in retrospect, I think we understand much better. And that's sort of where Protham's work comes in. And Protham's work was very important in teaching us what does matter. But I think for a long time, we were just floundering, running randomized control trials and discovering, for example, if you double the teacher-student ratio, it doesn't change grades at all. So that's a very expensive way to spend money. Teachers are expensive. It turns out that it didn't do anything. So I think it did put us in a place where we were really, we actually sort of in the process realized how important it was to go from that generality that you should spend more resources to education, to the specificity. This is how we spend the resources, and that's almost all of the game. That you could spend huge amounts of money on education. So to give an example of something, Indonesia conveniently did a randomized control trial because where they allow teachers' salaries were doubled. This was supposed to do all kinds of miraculous things. It did nothing. It budged the test scores even a little bit. So I think we know lots of things of this class, which is that whatever our presumptions be, and there are perfectly good reasons, of course, why one might think that these things are, paying teachers more is better. I'm not even against paying them more. I think we all had the presumption that this will do a lot, and it didn't do anything. So I think the devil is unfortunately in the details. So what we do in JPAL, coming back to what I already said, is we often do randomized control trials to figure out what works and what doesn't. And many of these, what I already mentioned and I'll continue mentioning, were things that we learned from that process. And I certainly want to say one thing at this point. I will, the most of what we've learned, and that's, I'm glad you heard both Adnan and Oriana before me, is that there's much good news. It's not that all the news is bad, but I think it's not that we did find many things work. It just many things that people thought work didn't work. And so one of the great advantages of having this hammer of the randomized control trial is that you use it to find out things, the nails that don't actually penetrate, and that's sort of what we've been doing. There's been at this point 1,150 randomized control trials, and they cover in 93 countries. They cover, every possible area where you might think you could affect the lives of the poor, which go from agriculture, crime, violence, education, environment, gender, health, labor market, so political economy. So we have no commitment to any particular narrative, and that's been very important for us. We didn't start with a narrative about what what would be the right way to go about it. And I think by being entirely agnostic about it, I think we managed to learn a lot, because sometimes you learn, you see that things work in the most unexpected places. So at this point, I want to take a pause and go back to what I started with saying, which is that when we started, our goal, as I said, was at some broad level, let's put some evidence out there. And I think the presumption was that the reason why we want to do randomized controlled trials was mostly that, a lot of what people were doing, calling evaluations, were terrible. And that was true. What they were calling evaluations had they had no reason to compare. They were comparing people who, microcredit is an example I come to. We would take the beneficiaries and say that, well, woman beneficiary X got $100 and soon had $2,000. Woman Y, who was not a beneficiary, didn't. But woman Y had no intention of going there. Going back to, again, Oriana's point, she was not planning to start a business, so she didn't go there, and there's no news there. And I think there was a lot of this kind of comparing of apples and oranges that were going on. And so putting some discipline on it was important. What I think we had not fully understood, and I think that is how much of that was not so much about, the statistical fact that, yes, you can get unbiased estimates by doing randomized control trials. You compare like with like, and rather than about, you can design the experiment that you actually need to answer a particular question, which is, if you look at the data in the world, the real handicap with it is sometimes you can use it, you find policy changes which you can interpret quite credibly as a quasi-experiment. The constraint is that the world doesn't do things in order to generate knowledge. It does things in order to generate outcomes. And therefore, lots of the experiments that we do run, would not happen in the world. They do not happen in the world. The experiments are actually manipulations of very specific beneficial interventions, which we'll never see in the world. And I think the real power of experiments has often been to pinpoint a question that is otherwise gets asked in a very broad, sweeping way. So we get to cut it into little pieces and address them. And I think that's where the real power of the experiments have been, is in giving us the lever to the sort of the flashlight to flash on little points and to identify out of those. And so, and I'll come back to that, the question that, in a sense, Oriana was also talking about, which is where does that add up? And can it add up to anything significant? But I'll come back to that point as we move. So what I want to do now is just go through and talk about a bit what are the kinds of learnings we've had, and in the process a little bit highlight the point I was making, which is that as we often started with the idea of generating doing evidence for one kind of big picture question, but then that evolves into a number of steps into finer and finer and more questions which then go much closer to understanding what's going on, rather than saying this doesn't work. And those are, of course, both important to know what works and what doesn't, and also important to know why something works and something doesn't. And we get closer to the second as we go. So this was a long time ago. But it was, I think there was a early 2000s, microcredit was kind of the flavor of the decade. And there was a great deal of excitement, I think mostly warranted, about the possibility that if you gave people, mostly women, small loans, remarkably, those loans got repaid. And that was already news, and that's why I said it's important that it was being highlighted, because I think the first order presumption that was already, I think, nullified by the fact that the loans got repaid was that these poor people are just feckless. They won't be able to handle a loan. And that was already a very strong presumption in a lot of the culture. So I think it was very important to take that on, to show that, look, whatever else, they repaid their loans. And so it started with this evidence that they do repay the loans, which remains true and remains, I think, already one of the most striking facts. It's worth underscoring, because we forget history. We forget that, in the 1990s, we didn't believe that poor people are able to take loans. Now we think they can take loans and repay. We don't forget that that's already a transformation of where we stood. But then there was the question of, does it actually make people richer? The answer is not really. At the median, it has zero effect, which is a randomized controlled trial. The first of actually several, but we did the effect on the median household's consumption, very precisely zero. Okay? I'll come back to. I'll emphasize the word median, and I'll come back to why I'm emphasizing it, because, as I said, it's useful to also revisit the nuances and come back. And the reason was that, they took the money. It had an impact on their. So the darker bar, the bluish bar is the people who had microcredit, the ones who, the other one is not. You see some difference in their consumption, expenditure, and durables they buy, but most of that is not business. Business, about the third of the difference is business. Most of it is non-business, meaning they're taking these loans, they're buying refrigerators, televisions, whatever, something, they're repairing their houses. They're doing all kinds of things that I would do with a loan, entirely sensible things, but they're not even trying to get richer. That's something that we, in poor economics, we emphasize a lot, is that the real issue is not that these people are incapable of getting richer, but this is they have no desire to take this path to get richer. So they may, if you tell them you have to start a business and, make it fly to become richer, they will say yes, but that's not what I want to do with my life. And I think that's very, very, very clear in the evidence that that's not what they want to do in is the pressure of taking a loan, repaying it, incrementally growing a business by starting with nothing, that's not for them. So that's something that we took to heart. This is, what we find at the median or at the mean. Median is even more similar. This is what I already said. They were not intending to expand their business. But this is a moment where let me go a little further. Now, we track these people actually over many years, the treatment group and the control group. And through ups and downs, which were entirely not in our plan, meaning at some point the government of the state of Andhra Pradesh, where this experiment happened, shut down microcredit. And then it restarted. So for a while they had no loans, and then the loans came back. And so we tracked them through all that. When you look at them, between 7 and 9 years later, you see that, in fact, something we missed was not actually visible. So there's no way to not miss it. At the point where we had the data I showed you, which is about 2 years after they got the microloan, is that 5% of that population start to diverge. They start to, and those 5% are not random. They're the people who had the businesses before microcredit came. There were already people who had started businesses without the inducement of take a loan, start a business. So they started businesses on their own. And those people, if you look at them, there's huge effects on them, actually. The effects on that particular subgroup is enormous. And that reflects a fact that I think a subsequent really beautiful experiment by 3 of our PhD students, who are now all professors at Harvard Business School, find. And this is Reshma Hussam, Natalia Rigol, and Ben Roth have a paper. What they do is, it's a beautiful experiment. They go to the microfinance groups near Bombay and ask them, what is it that in your group, who do you think is the best entrepreneur? And they do all kinds of sophisticated things to make sure that people don't say me, including, for example, rewarding. If your answer matches that of the others, then you'll get a prize, things like that. So you can do, there's something called Bayesian truth serum. There's all kinds of nice mechanism design for those of you who are customers of economic theory to play with. But when you do it, you find that actually mostly people tell the truth in any case. So it's not such a big issue. Take that as a given. Okay, so they find that, so they have the predicted best people, predicted mediocre people, predicted worst people. Then they randomly give, and this is give, not give alone, give them a gift of $100 to some to the best people, predicted best people, some to predicted mediocre people, some to predicted least good people. And what they find is that the best people have returns of 20% per month or more on the money. And the worst people have 0 on the money. And because most people don't do, worst people already know that they are not going to go anywhere with the money. They often just spend it on something else. So it's not just that they put it in the business. They don't often. But it's what that's saying is that there is, first, what I said before, which is that there is huge diversity already. There's these people who are self-selected into being business people, and they're different. And even within those people, there's huge differentiation. So one of those, going back to a point that Oriana made, one of the ways in which I think we can see that these are people who already have loans. There were already people who were borrowing. The market was trying to serve them. The market was failing miserably in identifying clearly, these people were all in microfinance groups. Some of them were getting 0% on the marginal return on the money. Others were getting 20% marginal returns on the money per month. Those are per month, 20% is astronomical returns. And yet these people were undistinguished by the microfinance model. And something that we have noted about the microfinance model, that it's a model that exactly avoids trying to distinguish between people. It's just say, because it starts from the ideology that everybody can be an entrepreneur, it treats everybody as an entrepreneur, but gives them all small loans. But clearly what this is pointing to is there are some people who really are ready to expand, and if you could identify them, you could give them much bigger loans and they could become much bigger, and the others will never go there and will sort of wasting their time by trying to get them to be entrepreneurs. And I think that whole narrative, I think, has now, I think, has become increasingly clearer as we go. And in that sense, I think the fact that you could start from a very kind of broad-based impact evaluation, but they can refine the question in these many ways, makes it a very powerful tool. Let me give you another example, and this one is also very common. You hear it all the time, including among people who you might think might know better. So like free money, it's really this complete obsession in the economics profession that free money makes people lazy. It's a strange one, because in a sense, if you take the economic theory seriously, then you should not complain about the people who become lazy. In a sense, becoming lazy is just a form of consumption. If they don't want to eat apples, they want to eat leisure, that's fine. If you take the economic theory seriously, then you should really not worry about it. But nonetheless, you hear it all the time. You worry. So this is something we did. We put together actually evidence from other randomized control trials where people were given conditional cash transfer, but not conditional working on something else. Children going to school, giving them medicine, this and that. And these are what happened to the treatment and control group labor supplies. So the key point is that there is zero difference between them. One by one, zero difference between them. There's no evidence whatsoever. So, but it continues. When during the pandemic, the Trump administration was sending money to the pandemic hit households, there was a lot of pushback against it. For example, from the Wall Street Journal, which is representative of economic wisdom. The Wall Street Journal had this headline which says, "We pay people not to work, fewer will work." They assert it. And then they say, except at Yale. Why do they say except at Yale? Because there was actually many people studying the CARES program, the program that they were criticizing. This is the paper by a set of Yale economists. Actually, there are 6 papers which all have different empirical strategies for studying the same program. They find the same thing. And the point of this graphic is that this is where the money was offered. These are replacement ratios. So this is how much more money you would make if you stopped working, 5 times more. So it's clear that the people who were paid the least work the least. But notice that the drop happens before. After the cutoff, all of them are flat. Nothing changes. So this was but the Wall Street Journal nevertheless kept insisting that this had to be true. And this is the Krugman headline. So this is the one I ate up some of my time, because I figured this one I'm going to skip because Oriana told you about this and Adnan told you about this. So I think you're good on this one. But I think it's important. I'll just emphasize that, well, again, I think what is partly also important here was what we've learned subsequently. So the question then arises, once you accept this, and I think there's 7 randomized controlled trials which find the same outcome. They're all put together in a single paper, except the one that Oriana did, which has some other quite beautiful facts in it. And they find the same thing, which is that this fact that one-time boost can have durable effects. We find that in India, I think the 2 things that I think as I said, some of the most interesting stuff comes out in the subsequent work. So let me tell you a little bit about this. Some of it's in the slides, but I probably can go faster by telling what they are. So one is, interestingly, and this is a little bit builds on what Oriana said, a little bit maybe makes it, I think, more striking. It's exactly right. First transformation is if you give people an asset, they have the asset. So they give you, if you give them livestock, they have livestock. If you give them whatever, in Peru, we I think gave them guinea pigs, they have guinea pigs. But we track them for 10 years in India, and we see that that's only the first step. At year 3, most of their extra income is coming from the livestock. At year 7, most of their income is not coming from livestock, it's coming from some non-agricultural business that they have set up. That's where the extra income is coming. At year 10, actually, most of the extra income is coming from the children who have now grown up and have migrated. And you see big differences in the migration patterns. The children migrate further, they go away because the parents can support them for longer. They take more risk in their migration. They go to more distant cities and set up, get more better paid jobs. So you start to see, so it's not just that this one-time boost pays off at different points in their life in different ways. People are not doing the same thing. It's just, they're not just holding on to the cow. They're actually doing different things. And doing the different things is reflecting the fact that they seem to have more confidence or more ability to navigate the world. Then it's not just that they are sort of protecting the one asset they have. That's already would be good news, because there was, I think, the presumption before this were these very poor people, they just sell the asset and eat up the money. And that didn't happen. But then we see that, in fact, it's not just that they get richer over time, they got richer by doing different things over time. That's one thing I think was, and that reflects, I think, that gives me confidence that they are actually much more comfortable in the world. I have
in total 13 minutes.
13 minutes, okay. I'll take 3 more to finish, and then. So the second interesting insight we find is that we start to do experiments where we try to break this program into its components. So one component potentially is there is both some assets and some sort of emotional and maybe emotional support and know-how transfer. And the question is it just the asset? Is it the know-how transfer? And again, that might be very different in this particular population, because these are often people who never actually done anything very much in their life. They already had very sort of marginal jobs. So in that sense, maybe these people don't need the know-how. We did one experiment in Ghana where we find that without the know-how transfer, we don't see any effects. So maybe the know-how transfer is important for this population. The second thing is in Ghana, we did another experiment within this experiment where we tried to figure out why are they, what's making them more productive. And the reason why that's complicated is that, of course, when you give people an asset, then first thing is that they are, they have nothing to do, and now they have a cow, they have something to do. So the marginal product of their effort goes up because they have something to do with it. But also maybe they're more, they have more a backup. They have an asset, so they can take more risks. Or they have more confidence, or they feel just better because they got something. So which of these things matters? And one thing that we could do is we set up an experiment where we gave them all the inputs and then look at the effect of just getting actually a small amount more or less of money during the first weeks of the program, and you also give them some consumption support. We vary the consumption support and look at what is the effect of that on productivity. And because we give them all the inputs and we buy it from them, they face no risk, and they don't have to, the inputs are the same for everybody. So in the people who have this program and people who don't get the same inputs. So they don't have to use the money to buy the input. So it's not because they can buy more inputs that they're more productive. They're more productive, it seems to be because they just feel better about themselves. And that's related to Frank's work on the effect of people feeling the stress of not having money and how that makes people unproductive. So I think these series of experiments is trying to, again, breaking apart what is it that makes, why does giving some very poor people some money matter? And we start to understand that there are many channels, but that includes the psychological channel that people do actually feel. So let me, as you can see, I can keep going. But I think you give a sense of I think these more drawn out examples, I think if they do one thing, it's to maybe give a flavor of why we're excited about the work we do, and why I think there is a possibility of actually understanding, going deeper and deeper into the understanding of what's going on, which will then allow us to design better programs, because we'll understand what is it that exactly we're trying to target. We start with programs which tend to be very broad brush, hit it with the most powerful thing you have. For example, 50% of the cost of the program that Oriana described, at least in India, came from the handholding. If we can dispense with the handholding, I would say we could cover twice as many people. So these are very, very large decisions in a sense, and so getting that right is critical. And I think the advantage of the experimental approach, because we can keep tweaking and keep looking at it, is precisely that we can try to find what really works. I'll stop there and take questions. Yeah.
Thank you so much. It was so interesting. One question. For many years, I have supported microloan because I thought that was the best way to help them to help themselves for long term. And I have been supporting hand in hand and other organization. But now I understand that is wrong. So what are you saying about Graham Bank, for example?
I said it's wrong. I said you giving people, the fact that if the bank refused me a loan to buy my house, I would be worse off. I don't think one should, I think we are often too judgmental when we say that people should take the money and start a business. I think taking the money and buying a television, if that makes them happy, is a perfectly good thing to do. So first, I don't at all want to say that, you know, I'm not someone who takes the view that everyone should start a business in the first place. The second thing I want to say is that, what I think we learned is that for some people, it's an extremely powerful, intervention, and they make them much richer. We just need to do that better. I think the real takeaway should be we should be putting pressure on the microfinance organizations to be much more sophisticated in how they lend. There is information out there, because if you ask the other people in the group, they tell you who's the best entrepreneur. Why aren't we using that?
Questions? I'll try to.
Yeah.
The first one being, first of all, thank you for the presentation. I think the question was that I understand that poverty alleviation programs have to be a collaborative effort of different parties. You need economists to do the research, understand the problem. You need sort of private and public sector support for capital and sort of implementation. There are also many other actors. You need local or domestic support and so on and so forth. So since we also just learned a while back that we already have all the resources we need, so then in the research which you have done, did you specifically find areas or actors where you felt that this particular segment would be improved, then it would be easier to scale up these programs or to?
That's a very complicated question. I'm going to answer one piece of it, which is I would say to first, given what you already know, if there was a lot more money around, there will be a lot less poor people. I think I think we can complicate life in many ways then, and I think we could do better, but I think given what we know, I think money is a big constraint.
Second one being that you just now mentioned about happiness. Very recently, we are also trying to measure happiness indices of countries and comparing it to like GDPs, which and trying to find that maybe in Scandinavia, where GDP per capita is really above the world average, the happiness indices are.
Denmark is the happiest country in the world.
Yes, but and then people also make claims that it's not because they're necessarily very happy, but it's also because they're also very content with everything they have. There are fewer things making them less happier. But talking about developing countries, I think it's more important to increase happiness indices alongside their.
Let me say again, to elaborate a question, but let me answer one piece of it, which is one striking fact that we didn't know, but our recent work, again with Frank, has unearthed, is that if you look at the elderly in India, the depression rates are stunningly high, especially elderly women are stunningly high depression rates. So if you take one measure of happiness, which is not being clinically depressed, I think 40% are clinically depressed. Is that right?
There are these signs of
depression. Yeah. So that's a number that should make us all very unhappy.
More questions?
Yeah, thank you for a very interesting presentation. My name is Lube Tirsoris. I work at the Chief Economist team at Sveriges.
Speak up a little bit.
Even more? Okay.
Yes.
So straight to the question. I was always very curious about, I really see the added value of RCTs, but I was always curious about the sort of ethical dimension of this with and non-treatment groups, especially when the target and the people involved are in poverty. So if you could elaborate a bit on that.
Yeah, I never found that argument. I mean, if we knew the answer, then maybe there is something to be said about it, which is if I were to take away something that I already know works, but giving people microcredit or not, I mean, since we know that in ex post we know that it was, on average, it did nothing. Some people are worse off, some people are better off. I don't see any ethical question there. I think the ethical question is why, how dare we do things without knowing, so many interventions in the world. We take money that in a sense we could have just handed to people as cash. How can we justify not handing them the cash and doing policies without knowing nothing? I think that's I think the ethical question I want to flip back and say that I think the real shame is that we feel that enough confidence in our judgment that we are willing to, the standard should be, if nothing else, let's just take every poor person, take the money we are going to spend on some program and give it to them, as cash and just walk away from it. That should be a standard. If we can't do better than that, we shouldn't do it. So I think the presumption, so we need to have, that's why I think the ethical question is mostly, to me, the one of how are we justifying using money that could be just given away to do something else? And when we want to do that, let's do it for the right reason.
One or two questions more.
Comparing education versus trying to change a very hierarchical system or changing culture, ethics, where do you see, is there a second avenue that one could take in poverty?
No, I would say that I don't think we have any reason to believe that we can change culture. But then culture changes fast. I mean, the important, we forget that in the early 60s, there was a report on South Korea saying that South Korea has been doomed because they're culturally not really prepared for capitalism. So, I think the wisdom of cultures is, our wisdom of cultures is, I think, so being exploded that I tend to be optimistic on that. I think if the opportunities are there, the cultures often adjust. We start with a lot of very feel like very compelling stereotypes. They're not sure they are actually binding. Or I've never seen much evidence that they're binding.
Thank you, Yomar from the Red Cross. I have one question to go
You also
together.
have to speak up, sorry.
Okay, thanks. Question is, or my thought regardless this insight that you just mentioned about giving a one-time boost. For our experience is that in situation of a crisis, save lives is primary target, and then help them to build back better. Usually now we use cash vouchers to help them, but also from the perspective that you were in about people feeling better, feeling more empowered, but also a word that we haven't heard too much today, dignity. I think it's also a question about people deciding if they want to use that money to buy some food or to support a house to build. And so, when you mentioned the different studies that experiments that you're doing, how are they affected, if they are at all, when it comes to sudden shocks? For example, weather hazard, a war, a conflict, epidemics, and so how will the effect of the results will be?
I think that to reiterate the obvious, which is that if all the whatever you built has collapses with the earthquake, there's not going to be any benefits from whatever previous investment. So I think the point you make is more, I think, about there's clearly times when you want to just go in, and I think this is space, and in Japan now we have started a humanitarian sector exactly with this. I mean, sometimes the real question is, how do I get emergency support to someone? Not ask the question, how do I help them get richer? But what's the best way to get people who are, who just lost their house and their home? How do we support them? And again, there you might think that, for example, you should just give people money. But in fact, there's a very nice experiment among the Rohingyas in Bangladesh, showing that, in fact, the Rohingyas in these camps prefer to be, they will take less money if you give them something to do than if you just give them the money. So, I mean, it's clear that those kinds of questions about what gives people dignity or confidence in life, or some sense of the way they want to live their lives is critical also.
With that, a big applause to Professor Banerjee.